The perception of solidity is a foundational element in experience. It is an assumption operating constantly that dictates how the world is understood. Objects appear to possess an inherent unwavering existence, persisting independently of observation. This sense of solidity functions as a critical scaffold for navigating the environment. Without it, the predictability necessary for basic interaction would disintegrate. Movement becomes problematic. Reaching, grasping, and even standing all rely upon the belief in a stable external reality. This assumption arises naturally from consistent sensory input. The flow of data arriving from eyes, ears, and skin creates the impression of a continuous, unified world. The brain interprets this flow, identifying patterns and constructing representations. These representations solidify into familiar objects and spaces. It is not that these objects do not exist, rather their existence is not as it appears. The perceived solidity is a projection, a conceptual overlay applied to a constantly changing stream of phenomena. Sustaining conditions reinforce this belief. The nervous system tends towards pattern recognition, actively seeking order within unpredictable information. This predisposition generates predictive models, forecasts about the future based on past experience. To act effectively, organisms must anticipate outcomes. A reliance on predictable interactions strengthens the conviction of inherent solidity. The biological imperative to control the environment further solidifies this impression. An environment perceived as stable is one that can be managed. Examination of sensory phenomena reveals a contrasting picture. Each perception arises and ceases dependent on a complex web of factors. Light waves impacting the retina, electrochemical signals traversing neurons, cognitive interpretation, all contribute to the experience of an object. Remove any element from this causal chain and the phenomenon vanishes. There is no inherent persistence. A table appears solid because it consistently presents itself under specific conditions, but those conditions are contingent, not intrinsic. The apparent solidity is a construction of the nervous system, a functional convenience built on a foundation of impermanence. The very act of interaction requires a momentary suspension of this perception. To grasp a cup, for instance, the brain calculates trajectory, velocity, and force. This process extends beyond the immediate sensation of the cup's presence. It anticipates contact, resistance, and consequences. During that calculation, the perceived solidity momentarily ceases to be relevant. It is an abstraction, a conceptual frame that must be put aside to facilitate action. This interplay between sensory input and motor output demonstrates the fleeting nature of the assumption. The stability attributed to external phenomena is not a characteristic of the phenomena themselves, but a product of the cognitive processes involved in interaction. The continuous narrative of solidity is an illusion born of conditioned responses. The sense of a fixed, independent object is revealed to be a temporary phenomenon. The conviction of inherent solidity dissolves into the flux of arising and ceasing. The sense of stress frequently appears as a discrete entity. It feels immediate, a pressure exerted upon the individual. This perception establishes a foundation for subsequent thought. The feeling itself is undeniably present, a physiological response accompanied by emotional valence. However, the assumption that this feeling exists independently requires closer consideration. The common understanding attributes stress to external conditions. Situations, relationships, or duties are posited as direct instigators. It is believed that these sources initiate the stressful response. The individual then experiences a reaction to an objective cause. This causal link solidifies the feeling's apparent autonomy. It appears to function outside of mental processes. This framework relies on language. Labels such as pressure, anxiety, or burden are applied to the experience. These labels create a sense of differentiation. They carve out a specific category within the flow of sensory input. The individual then identifies with this categorized experience. This identification reinforces the belief in its inherent, independent nature. Further examination reveals that the feeling is inextricably linked to meaning. The raw sensory data, physiological changes, emotional shifts do not inherently possess the quality of stress. It is the imposition of meaning that transforms them. The mind structures the information, creating a narrative of threat or overwhelm. This narrative is not a reflection of an inherent property. It is a constructed interpretation. The sustaining condition is the urge to explain. The mind searches for a cause, a reason for the feeling's presence. This search frequently leads to the assignment of blame, either to oneself or to external factors. The individual then becomes trapped in a cycle of justification and resentment. The initial feeling is compounded by layers of meaning. This creates a sense of inescapable burden. Removing the imposed meaning is not an act of negation. It does not erase the physiological response or the accompanying emotional shift. It simply dissolves the artificial boundary. The feeling becomes simply what is: a sequence of impulses, a cascade of sensations. It is experienced without the filter of judgment or categorization. The attribution of independent existence is a conceptual construct. It is a product of linguistic habit and culturally reinforced narratives. The feeling does not vanish upon recognizing this dependency. It continues as a physiological phenomenon. However, the sense of stress as an autonomous entity diminishes. The constructed framework collapses, leaving only the raw sensory data. It is simply what is. The experience of discomfort registers as something: a pressure, a heat, a constriction, identifiable features composing what is often named stress. It appears self-evident that these features exist as discrete phenomena. The tightening in the shoulders feels distinct from the ache in the lower back. The sensation of heat presents as a separate entity. This conviction contributes to a fundamental misunderstanding. Dissatisfaction originates from the insistence that these components possess inherent existence. The assumption establishes a foundation, this sensation independent of any other factor. Because it is something to be managed, to be endured, or to be eliminated. The effort to manage generates further discomfort. The struggle to endure amplifies the perceived negativity. The pursuit of elimination introduces frustration. Each action reinforces the initial assumption, perpetuating a cycle. This assumption gains traction from the tendency to segment experience. The impulse to dissect, to analyze, appears rational. It aligns with standard modes of inquiry. We naturally seek to understand how something arises by examining its parts. This process, however, generates a false sense of clarity. It creates the illusion of separate entities where none exist. Consider the sensation of tightness. We observe it, classify it, and assign it characteristics. This process implies a solidity, a permanence that does not correspond to reality. The tightness is not an isolated event. It is influenced by posture, by respiration, by muscle tension in surrounding areas. Alter one condition and the tightness shifts, diminishes, or disappears. The intensity perceived is a function of this interplay, not an inherent quality of the sensation itself. The sensation of heat similarly lacks inherent existence. It arises from a confluence of factors: ambient temperature, nerve sensitivity, vascular dilation. To isolate the sensation of heat and declare it is to ignore the totality of conditions that give rise to it. The appearance of separateness is a construction, a product of the analytical mind. It's a conceptual framework imposed upon a dynamic process. The urge to investigate the precise neurological origins of these sensations proves counterproductive. Mapping pathways and identifying receptors does not illuminate the fundamental issue. It merely shifts the focus to another layer of analysis, reinforcing the mistaken assumption of inherent existence at a different level. The inquiry becomes another component of the cycle. When the assumption of inherent existence is questioned, the framework begins to dissolve. The sensations do not vanish, they remain. What disappears is the conviction that they are independent, self-contained entities. The pressure, the heat, the constriction. They are acknowledged as transient phenomena, arising and passing in accordance with conditions. They are understood as manifestations of interdependence. The effort to manage, to endure, or to eliminate ceases. The cycle breaks. The discomfort remains, but it no longer carries the weight of an inherent, separate existence. The perceived boundary softens. The persistent feeling of stress is often accepted as a single, ongoing state. This assumption holds a certain initial plausibility. The feeling seems to flow, one moment giving way to the next, building upon previous sensations and anticipating future outcomes. Discomfort accumulates, then subsides, then reasserts itself, creating a discernible pattern across perceived time. Suffering arises directly from the belief that this pattern represents a continuous entity. Action is taken to avoid, alleviate, or resolve this ongoing state. The efforts themselves contribute to an intensification of the initial feeling. Resources are expended in the pursuit of a resolution to what is considered a sustained experience. The duration of this perceived state appears constant. It seems to possess an independent existence, separate from the conditions that give rise to it. This impression is supported by the brain's function in constructing narrative. The brain organizes sensory input into sequences, identifying cause and effect, anticipating consequence. Memory plays a crucial role. Past experiences are recalled and integrated into the present moment, reinforcing the sense of an unbroken flow. These recalled experiences are often given interpretive labels. They are assigned meaning within an existing framework of understanding. Such labeling further solidifies the feeling of continuity. The expectation of linear temporality is a fundamental element in the maintenance of this assumption. The mind naturally arranges events in a chronological order. This ordering lends a sense of permanence to the perceived experience. A sequence of unpleasant sensations is understood as a singular event rather than a succession of discrete occurrences. The feeling is then treated as a unit, something to be managed, to be overcome. The assumption of continuity dictates this response. Careful examination reveals a different picture. Stress does not exist as a continuous phenomenon. It presents instead as a series of discrete events. Each moment is a unique combination of perceptual data and cognitive processing. These events arise and pass, momentarily existing within a field of potential. The feeling itself is a transient event, no more enduring than the sensation of heat or the perception of light. These moments are linked, not by an inherent connection, but by the mind's act of imposition. Mental labeling creates the illusion of duration. Interpretive frameworks generate the impression of continuity. The perceived continuity arises solely from the brain's construction of narrative. The memory of a previous moment informs the interpretation of the current moment. The expectation of a future moment influences the present experience. These are not inherent properties of the feeling itself, but rather activities performed by the cognitive apparatus. Without this continuous mental activity, the feeling dissolves into isolated fragments. The pattern vanishes, leaving only a succession of distinct moments. The concept of stress then ceases to have applicability. The duration imagined simply does not exist. The feeling of stress then arises from a false premise. The assumption of a stable self persists. It functions as a foundational premise for understanding experience. This premise suggests the existence of a continuous entity, an unchanging core that resides behind and organizes perception. This entity is implicitly believed to be the subject experiencing the world. The feeling of being a someone appears undeniable. Every interaction, every sensation seems filtered through this presumed subject. Actions are undertaken with the conviction that they originate from this self. Thoughts arise and they are attributed to it. Emotions are felt and they are linked to its state. This sense of ownership, this deep conviction of inherent being, is pervasive. This pervasive sense creates a framework for interpretation. It provides a reference point for assigning value. Events are categorized as beneficial or detrimental to this presumed self. Relationships are evaluated in terms of their impact on it. Future plans are designed to secure its well-being. The system operates on the implicit understanding that this self exists and will persist. This framework generates dissatisfaction. When circumstances deviate from expectations, discomfort arises. Loss, disappointment, and frustration are experienced as threats to this self. The desire to protect and preserve it becomes a constant source of anxiety. Seeking pleasure and avoiding pain becomes a relentless pursuit, all undertaken in the name of this assumed entity. The very structure intended to provide security becomes a source of instability. Consider the biological underpinnings. Neurological activity establishes a sense of bodily unity. Sensory input is integrated, creating a coherent perception of a physical form. This bodily form is then identified as belonging to the self. Social recognition reinforces this identification. Language assigns a name, a label, which serves as a marker of individual identity. Conventions dictate behaviors expected of this identity. These factors coalesce, solidifying the impression of a discrete and enduring being. Yet, careful examination dissolves this impression. The body, the foundation of this perceived self, undergoes constant change. Cells regenerate, tissues degrade, and physical form transforms over time. The neurological processes are similarly impermanent. Thoughts are fleeting, emotions transient, sensations ephemeral. These experiences arise and cease, demonstrating an absence of a permanent substrate. The label assigned by society is a construct, an agreement facilitating social interaction, not an inherent characteristic. The actions attributed to the self are responses to conditions, driven by causes and effects. Identity is a convenient fiction. Personal continuity is a narrative woven from discrete moments. The feeling of being a someone is a useful tool for navigating the world, not evidence of an immutable truth. Its utility does not validate its existence. To believe otherwise is to cling to a mirage. The assumption of a stable self ceases to function as a reliable foundation. The impulse to avoid stress operates under a foundational belief. Stress is undesirable. This perception appears logical. The experience of stress typically involves sensations interpreted as unpleasant. Physical tension, mental agitation, emotional distress. These are routinely classified as negative states to be escaped. The impulse to alleviate these sensations then arises, driven by a desire for comfort and ease. This desire is itself a powerful force-shaping behavior. Consider the mechanics of this avoidance. An individual encounters a situation generating internal pressure. The sensation of that pressure is immediately labeled stress. This label carries with it the implication of something harmful, something to be diminished. The individual then initiates actions intended to reduce or eliminate the pressure. These actions can range from simple adjustments in posture to complex rearrangements of circumstances. The ultimate aim is restoration, a return to a prior state perceived as less burdensome. The effectiveness of this process is contingent. In some instances, the actions succeed, the pressure subsides, and the individual experiences a temporary reprieve. This reinforces the initial belief: stress is undesirable and avoidance is a valid strategy. However, the reprieve is not a solution. The fundamental condition, the initial stressor, remains. It is merely postponed. Furthermore, the act of avoidance itself generates its own form of tension. The energy expended in resisting, in manipulating circumstances, in maintaining a state of perceived safety, accumulates. The classification of stress as undesirable is not an inherent truth. It is a judgment, a conceptual overlay applied to a sensation. The sensation itself, the pressure, the tension, the heightened awareness, simply its interpretation as negative, is a product of a cognitive process. This process relies on a framework of values prioritizing comfort and well-being. Biological drives toward homeostasis contribute to this preference. The body naturally seeks equilibrium. Yet, the aversion to pain, the active rejection of anything deemed stressful, is not determined by the sensation itself. It is an imposition of meaning. To observe the sensation without the interpretative layer is to encounter a neutral phenomenon. It is an experience, no more, no less. The assumption that it be avoided generates a secondary layer of dissatisfaction. The anxiety of anticipating stress, the regret of experiencing it, the effort of escaping it. These are all consequences of the initial judgment. The impulse to avoid, therefore, expands the scope of perceived negativity. It amplifies the experience it seeks to negate. The initial belief, the assertion that stress is inherently undesirable, is contingent upon a framework of values. Without that framework, the sensation remains simply a sensation. It is a state of being, unburdened by evaluation. The impulse to avoid stress therefore dissolves, as the foundation of that impulse is revealed as a construct. It is a fabrication that no longer holds. The sense of stress arises, and with it, a corresponding distinction. There appears to be a feeling, an experience of distress, and then there is the stress itself. This separation establishes two distinct entities: the one who feels and the thing that is felt. This is a seemingly straightforward delineation, a practical division that allows for description and analysis. Yet it is built on a foundational assumption: the belief in a separation between observer and observed. The feeling of stress in its immediate occurrence does not present itself as belonging to anything. It simply is. However, the conceptual mind immediately assigns it. It categorizes the sensation as mine, belonging to a defined self. This self is then positioned as distinct from the sensation itself. The sensation becomes an object of experience, a phenomenon to be examined by the observer. The observer, in turn, is assumed to be a stable, enduring entity. This assumed separation is not demonstrable as an objective reality. It is a pattern of interpretation, a cognitive habit. The feeling of stress is recognized, labeled, and contextualized. The recognition requires an act of observation. and the act is understood to be performed by someone, something stable, that is separate from what is observed. This is the core of the mistaken assumption. The feeling of stress is not first encountered as a discrete entity. It emerges within a field of experience, alongside other sensations, thoughts, and perceptions. These elements are interconnected, mutually influencing one another. The act of designating one as stressor and another as observer is an artificial partitioning. The observer is not an independent agent encountering an external phenomenon. The observer is a transient configuration of processes, inseparable from the field of experience within which the sensation arises. Consider a wave on the surface of water. It appears as a distinct form, rising and falling. Yet it is not separate from the water itself. It is the water moving, shaped by forces acting upon it. The wave does not exist without the water, the water, momentarily manifesting in a particular pattern. Similarly, the feeling of stress is a pattern within a larger ongoing field of experience. The observer is not outside this field, it is simply another pattern, a temporary configuration within that same process. The distinction between observer and observed, therefore, dissolves upon closer examination. The feeling of stress does not require a separate entity to exist. It exists as a moment within experience, conditioned by a multitude of factors. The assumed separation, the foundation for recognizing stress as a discrete problem, is revealed as a conceptual imposition. It is a framework applied after the fact, not a condition of the experience itself. The feeling is simply a feeling, and the notion of its being observed is an imposition. The division ceases to hold. The persistent designation of experience as stress functions as an initial and foundational error. It appears useful because it provides a readily available descriptor for a range of physiological and emotional responses. These responses often involve increased heart rate, muscular tension, and subjective feelings of anxiety or overwhelm. The application of this label seems logical when evaluating a situation perceived as demanding or challenging. However, this immediate utility masks a significant operational problem. The word stress establishes a conceptual framework. This framework anticipates and organizes sensory input. It predetermines how a given situation will be understood. Sensory data, initially unclassified, are quickly assigned to this pre-existing category. Subsequent perceptions are then interpreted in relation to this designation. A rapid sound, for example, does not simply register. It is processed as contributing to or alleviating the established stress. This categorization process isn't neutral, it inherently reduces complexity. A multifaceted interaction is condensed into a single, often negative, label. Nuance is lost. Subtle variations in tone, posture, or environmental factors are disregarded as irrelevant to the presumed overarching condition. The phenomena simply are. The imposition of stress creates a filtering effect, diminishing the richness of immediate perception. The reliance on this categorization operates conditionally. It arises from habituated linguistic patterns. We learn to associate certain situations with specific terms. This associative learning reinforces the framework, perpetuating its use. The desire for simplification is also a contributing factor. Applying the label stress is quicker and more convenient than detailed analysis. It provides a superficial sense of understanding. This efficiency, however, comes at the cost of accurate representation. The ongoing application of stress does not reflect an inherent property of the situation. It reflects the imposition of a conceptual framework upon sensory input. The sensations and feelings remain unaltered. They do not require explanation by this imposed label. To perceive the sound, the posture, the environment, without the immediately applied designation, is to recognize the absence of the need for that designation. The phenomena simply are. The conceptual framework dissolves when its conditional nature is observed. The belief that the cessation of stress can be achieved through directed effort exists as a functional premise. It appears reasonable to assume that concentrated action will produce a corresponding result. This premise is attractive because it aligns with common experience. Deliberate action often alters circumstance. One applies effort, a circumstance changes, and a connection is established. The validity of this process, however, relies upon further unexamined conditions. The belief sustains itself on the implicit assumption of linear causality. Events are perceived as sequentially linked, one directly causing another. This framework suggests that stress, being an event, must be caused by something that can be altered. If the originating cause is located and addressed, stress will, by necessity, diminish. The act of addressing the cause is itself an act of directed effort. The promise of cessation is embedded within this chain of logic. Another sustaining condition involves the desire for control. Recognizing stress as an undesirable state fosters a drive to manage or eliminate it. The desire for control is predicated on the belief that one possesses the capacity to influence external events. This belief, too, reinforces the initial premise. If one can control the factors contributing to stress, one can control stress itself. Linked to control is the frustration that arises from persistent, unsuccessful attempts at change. The experience of frustration is itself an unpleasant state, intensifying the craving for resolution. This feedback loop strengthens the conviction that a solution must exist, and that this solution will be found through directed effort. The perceived failure to achieve cessation only reinforces the belief that more effort is required. This craving, the desire for the cessation of stress, becomes crucial. The craving itself is a causal process. It generates tension, anticipates absence, and perpetuates the seeking. The very action undertaken to eliminate stress, the directed effort, is fueled by the craving it attempts to resolve. The craving and the action are mutually reinforcing. They constitute a cycle. The assumption that cessation is attainable through effort depends entirely on this cycle's persistence. Disruption of the cycle requires a cessation of the craving. The craving is not eliminated by directed effort, but by the absence of effort. The action designed to end stress maintains the very condition it opposes. The promise of cessation, therefore, dissolves into the conditions that generate it. The premise collapses upon itself. There remains only the ongoing sequence of events. The experience arises as a weight. It is perceived as something borne, something endured. This feeling is not the problem, the attribution of it is. We label it, categorize it, and then declare it to be ours. This declaration establishes a connection, a possessive link between the feeling and a presumed subject. The feeling itself exists. The feeling simply unfolds. It is the assertion of ownership that generates the sense of burden. This assertion is predicated on an assumption. The assumption is that a stable, enduring self must exist to experience stress as a personal burden. This appears valid because it seems natural to view stress as something that is mine to bear. The naturalness of this view reinforces the assumption, creating a feedback loop. The perceived burden strengthens the sense of self. The sense of self perpetuates the perception of burden. Consider the conditions that support this view. Personal history plays a significant role. Memories, narratives, and past experiences are woven into a cohesive account of who one is. This account serves as a foundation for the presumed self, a point of reference for current experiences. Accountability is another sustaining condition. Actions are evaluated, consequences are assigned, and responsibility is assumed. This process requires an entity to which responsibility can be attributed. The belief in individual agency further reinforces the self. Decisions are made, actions are initiated, and intentions are pursued, all under the guise of a self directing its course. These conditions are not inherent, they are sustained. The maintenance of personal history relies on continual reaffirmation. Accountability depends on the presence of external observers and societal expectations. The belief in agency requires a framework of cause and effect within which actions are judged. These frameworks are not absolute. They are contingent upon shared understandings and cultural norms. When these understandings shift, the supporting structure weakens. Examination demonstrates that the perception of stress as a personal burden arises from the illusion of a stable self. Without this illusion, experience is simply unfolding. The weight remains, the feeling persists, but it is no longer a burden carried by a self. It is simply a phenomenon, an occurrence in the continuous flow of existence. The illusion dissolves and the feeling is released. It ceases to be. The assertion of ownership disappears. Experience simply continues. The impulse to define arises early. We encounter something, a sensation, a feeling, a perceived object, and seek to place it. To assign it a label, a category, a discrete entity within a framework of understanding. This process appears efficient. It permits communication. It allows us to share observations, to build upon knowledge, to navigate the environment with a sense of control. The world, arranged in neat boxes, becomes manageable. Yet the very act of categorization introduces a distortion. The thing itself is not the definition. The feeling is not the word. The object is not the label. To equate them is to create a separation that did not initially exist. This separation fosters a subtle, persistent dissatisfaction. We believe we have grasped something solid, something known, when in reality we have only grasped a representation. Consider the experience we designate as stress. An attempt to define it quickly encounters resistance. Is stress a physiological response, a psychological state, a social construct? Each possibility creates a further division, a narrowing of scope. No definition fully captures the breadth of what is felt. Each attempt to delineate its boundaries reveals its porosity, its lack of fixed form. What appears initially as a discrete entity dissolves upon closer inspection. The drive for definition originates in a cognitive predisposition. The human mind readily perceives patterns. It seeks to impose order on chaos. This is a useful function, undoubtedly. However, it operates as a bias, a lens that shapes perception. The desire for predictability reinforces this tendency. Knowing, or believing we know, provides a sense of security. A labeled world is a predictable world, and predictability is equated with comfort. Language itself contributes to this predicament. Words are tools, inherently limited in their ability to accurately convey experience. They are symbols, approximations, pointing toward something that inherently defies symbolic representation. The very structure of language demands division. It compels us to distinguish subject from object, to separate cause from effect. Experience, however, is often a seamless flow, a continuous unfolding that transcends such divisions. The insistence on definition creates a gap, a space between the thing as it is and the thing as it is named. Within that gap resides a quiet frustration, a persistent sense of incompleteness. The search for precision amplifies the feeling of lacking. We strive for a clarity that cannot be attained through categorization. The attempt to define yields only a description. The description is not the thing. The gap persists, maintained by the structure of thought. The desire to bridge it intensifies the separation. The need for boundaries reinforces the illusion of containment. The act of definition intended to clarify becomes its own obstacle. It is simply a process. The feeling of distress possesses a certain gravity. It registers as an immediate quality, a fixture within the sensory field. This appearance leads to a straightforward conclusion. Distress is inherent to the experience itself. The discomfort, the tension, the aversion. These seem to be the very essence of what is happening. To encounter a stressful situation is to encounter distress. The association feels absolute, a given. This initial assumption operates without scrutiny. We accept the unpleasantness as a fundamental characteristic of the encounter. The sensation of anxiety, for example, is not considered a product of something else, but simply anxiety, a negative attribute residing within the moment. Similarly, the emotional burden of grief is experienced as the totality of grief, not as a response to loss. The distress becomes the focal point, the entire phenomenon. This perspective is maintained by a system of conditioning. The evaluation of experience is intrinsically linked to preservation. Actions and thoughts are directed toward minimizing negative outcomes and maximizing positive ones. Suffering is actively avoided, and the potential for suffering dictates choices. This framework necessitates a distinction between what is considered favorable and what is unfavorable. The designation of good and bad becomes a habitual mode of assessment. These classifications then reinforce the initial connection between the event and its perceived distress. Further investigation demonstrates the fragility of this connection. The feeling of distress does not arise from the experience in a direct, immutable way. It is contingent upon a particular mode of perception. The intensity of the feeling, its perceived permanence, its ability to dominate awareness. These elements are not intrinsic properties of the stressful experience. They are the result of a misapprehension. Distress originates from a failure to recognize the underlying structure of existence. The characteristic of interdependence, the understanding that all phenomena arise in relation to other phenomena, is obscured. Everything exists in a web of causes and conditions, influencing and being influenced by everything else. This interwoven nature is not acknowledged. Instead, the experience is isolated, rendered as a discrete and self-contained entity. This isolation facilitates attachment. The fleeting nature of experience is ignored. The recognition that all things are impermanent, that nothing remains unchanged, is lost. This creates a clinging to the moment, a desperate attempt to grasp something that is inherently unstable. This attachment amplifies the feeling of distress, transforming it into a source of profound dissatisfaction. The presence of specific neurochemical processes does not explain the feeling itself. These are simply biological events occurring alongside perception. The correlation is not causation. The distress does not in these biological processes, it is a consequence of a perceptual error. When the mode of perception shifts, when interdependence becomes visible, the feeling of distress diminishes. The initial assumption that distress is an inherent quality of the stressful experience dissolves. The sensations and emotions remain, but their valence shifts. What was once experienced as overwhelmingly negative is now understood as a transient expression of an ongoing process. The feeling, once so solid, becomes permeable. The structure of the feeling itself ceases to exist. The feeling simply ceases. The feeling exists, it registers as unpleasant. The immediate reaction is to classify it as stressful. This classification is not intrinsic to the feeling itself, it is an imposition. The feeling is a sensory event, a fluctuation in bodily sensation, a change in internal state. It simply occurs. The assignment of stress is a secondary act. This act of classification is habitual. Repeated pairings of sensation and evaluation establish a pattern. A particular bodily tension, for instance, becomes consistently associated with the label stressful. The association strengthens with each repetition. This is not an inherent connection. It is a learned response. The feeling remains a feeling. The classification is a judgment layered upon it. The roots of this judgment extend further than immediate experience. Early life provides a significant conditioning. Caregiving behaviors, verbal pronouncements, and the general emotional climate all contribute to the formation of evaluative frameworks. A child experiencing discomfort may be told, "You're stressed." This communication reinforces the connection between discomfort and a specific designation. The child internalizes this association. The feeling is still a feeling, but now carries a predetermined valence. Cultural narratives amplify the process. Societal expectations surrounding productivity, achievement, and control contribute to a pervasive anxiety. Discomfort is often framed as a sign of inadequacy. The individual internalizes these narratives. Discomfort becomes not merely an unpleasant sensation, but a confirmation of failure. The feeling is unaltered. The classification expands in scope. This system of classification operates largely outside conscious awareness. The connection between sensation and judgment is so deeply ingrained that it feels automatic. The assumption that discomfort's stressful is accepted without question. It functions as a perceptual bias, a filter through which experience is processed. The world is not inherently stressful. The application of this label shapes the perception of the world. Consider a physical sensation like tightness in the chest. Without prior classification, it is simply a physical sensation. It can be observed, it can be acknowledged, it can be allowed to pass. The insistence on classifying it as stressful obscures the sensation itself. It generates further discomfort. It perpetuates the cycle of evaluation and reaction. The sensation persists, independent of its classification. The continued application of this bias obscures the possibility of different responses. It limits the range of experience. It reinforces a sense of helplessness. It is not the feeling itself that causes difficulty, it is the insistence on classifying it in a specific way. The classification is contingent. It is dependent on prior conditioning and cultural narratives. It is not an inevitable truth. The assumption collapses when the recognition of its constructed nature becomes clear. The feeling remains, the judgment evaporates. The inherent quality of experience is revealed to be neutrality. It is simply a passing phenomenon. The act of classification ceases. Experience is no longer filtered through a lens of predetermined evaluation. It remains experience. This is what persists. The impulse to define stress assumes its status as a discrete entity. This assumption seems logical. Clarification often proceeds through delineation. To understand something stable, it appears necessary to establish its boundaries, to isolate its characteristics, and ultimately to articulate what it. The act of definition promises a deeper comprehension, a revelation of essence. However, this promise remains unfulfilled. The very process of defining stress presupposes a separation between the observer and the observed. It necessitates a distinction, a line drawn between this and that. This boundary inherently reinforces the illusory solidity and separateness that the definition aims to clarify. To define is to create a frame, and the frame itself introduces a division where perhaps no inherent division exists. The reliance on language is integral to this process. Words function as containers, attempting to hold and represent experience. Stresses becomes a label, a linguistic construct applied to a complex and shifting phenomenon. This labeling creates a perceived stability, a sense of objectification. The individual experiencing discomfort, disruption, or overwhelm is categorized, assessed, and then named stressed. This naming process, however, does not eliminate the experience. It merely masks it under the guise of understanding. Intellectualization sustains this mistaken assumption. The desire to analyze, to break down, to catalog and classify reinforces the illusion of a discrete entity. It allows for a sense of control, the feeling that understanding equates to mastery. But the experience itself, the felt sense of imbalance, transcends the confines of language and the reach of rational analysis. The impulse to control arises from the belief that the experience is something to be managed, something external to the self. This belief is predicated on the assumption that stresses is a thing, a separable element. The structure of thought itself depends upon the act of definition. Language creates categories. Categories create boundaries. Boundaries reinforce separation. To define stress is therefore to participate in a system of categorization that perpetuates the very illusion it attempts to dispel. The effort to grasp the essence of stress inevitably strengthens the perception of its existence as a bounded phenomenon. The more one strives to define it, the more concrete it seems to become. The initial impulse, the desire for clarification, becomes its own perpetuation. It is a cycle of inquiry and reinforcement, a seemingly helpful endeavor that solidifies the misconception at its core. The distinction between stressor and stressed dissolves. The attempt to define simply demonstrates the constructed nature of the boundary. The notion of a discrete entity fades. The separation disappears. It is simply experience.